John Sticka, uh, I was I found it interesting. He did his first soil health presentation in 1992. I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah, I was alive then, just a little guy. And he said that today there was a lot of new faces that he had never seen before, and I think that was something that we were really trying to go for with this event. So, which is really nice to see. Um, we always talk about why, well, change, I guess, and why people don't change. And he had one thing that I had never read before, and he said that uncertainty registers in the brain as an error, which I think we always say that the biggest hurdle is the one between your eye or the one between your ears. You got to see things differently. So I had never heard that exact phrase before. And then the big picture depends upon small things. People always want a silver bullet or something that they can just, they just want the answer immediately. But it's thinking in management, and it's all these little things that are going to add up that actually make a difference. There's no just big magic thing that's going to happen. Also, the soil food web is supposed to be solar powered and not fossil fuel powered. And he said it's like putting diesel fuel in a gasoline engine. But the thing that's better about solar power is free. And in today's society, is there anything that's free besides solar power? So it's very profound, I think. We talk about that a lot. So then we moved on to Dan. And one of the first things he said is when he was trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life, he said he couldn't find a better lifestyle to raise a family than farming. So that hits home to me. I'm actually trying to pursue that myself. So maybe on a smaller scale, like a permaculture style scale. So then the other thing he said is, trying to find some common ground. He said, nowhere can you find somebody and ask them, should your food be nutritious? And someone says no. You can ask them, do you think organic's better? Do you think conventional's better? And you get different answers, but nobody's going to say, no, I don't think my food should be nutritious. So he kind of went to the summit there really quickly and found a way to find some common ground. And the one thing that we should take away, he mentioned how important inoculation was and starting off on the right foot. And I correlated it to our bioinoculant worm juice that we do at the Minokan farm. And this summer at the cover crop tour, Jay said he kind of had a different scenario. He said, when you're going to teach your kids how to be good people and how to have manners and how they should act, do you do it when they're 18 or do you do it when they're 2 years old? There's a big difference. You can do it either time, but you're going to have a way bigger difference way bigger impact of when you do it. And then the other thing that Dan mentioned was, if you have a fungi outbreak or you have an insect outbreak, nature is sending you a report card. If you have an insect or something, nature's saying, well, you did all right, but you could probably do a little better next time. So I'd never really heard that twist on it again. So and then on his last talk, surprising how there's little data there is on nutrient variation in food. You'd think, as big as food is in your life, it's everything, you would think there'd be more info on it. And he said, it doesn't matter what your label is, it matters what you actually do and how you grow things. So, and that's we correlate that to the Minokan farm too. We're try to be a very inclusive group out there. We don't matter what your production system is. The soil health principles that we teach kind of apply to everything. Then I'll go to Lindsay. I'm not very familiar with permaculture, but apparently I'm a permaculturalist. Me and my wife are apparently permaculturalists without really knowing it. So, but the zones 1 through 5, the things that you need most, or the things that need the most attention, you keep the closest to you. I think that's almost, maybe we do that without thinking, maybe, but then she said that I didn't know this, the first supermarket appeared in 1946. I would have thought it was earlier than that, but, so that's really interesting that just not very long ago, really, that, like she said, the food was in the farms and the fields and the basements and the cellars. And then the other thing that she spoke about was, she said, we've forgotten about a lot of things. And we've had other speakers up here that have said that same thing. They're not really inventing new technologies or doing anything. They're just kind of remembering what grandpa and great-grandpa probably did. Because there was probably a reason why great-grandpa had a dairy cow and cows and sheep and pigs and goats and chickens. So if nobody has a question, I can come up with one, but I'd like to hear some questions. Hopefully some people have been writing some down.
Well, mine isn't really much of a question, it's more of an observation. But Dan, your last presentation was pretty revolutionary. And I'm wondering what the USDA response has been to this. In this state, we don't like government overreach, and we fight against it in all kinds of things. But I would think this would be something that everybody in the country, we've talked about the nutrients and quality of nutrients, everybody in this country would be pushing for this. I know that there are probably people who would be opposed to what you're trying to do, big companies that would be opposed to it. So it might be something you need to be kind of watching your back sometimes, but I'm curious as to how USDA is reacting to what you're trying to do.
I don't know that they know what we're up to. I mean, some part of the USDA invited me to come here, so I mean, it's a big organization, and we got the FAR grant, which is part of the USDA that's supporting the greater work. You know, I mean, it's a big, USDA is a big ecosystem, a big organization, and I've generally found that the individuals that I've been in contact with are very much aligned and supportive and open and wanting to collaborate. I remember when I was in DC, you know, they were like begging us as an organization to engage. This was the ARS and NEFA, and they said, you know, we can't do anything until you talk to us, until you reach out to us and engage us. And we're just really a small educational nonprofit without the resources to do much more than, you know, keep the wheels from falling off of our basic project, keep the lab running, keep the money coming in to keep the lab running and stuff like that. So we're not a big company. We don't have a marketing budget. We don't, you know, we're not out there lobbying or anything like that. So, I mean, my thought is, and I've had this position where I will collaborate with anybody who's willing to collaborate with us. If you're willing to engage in the principles of open data and symbiosis, let's work with you. You know, we've got, you know, Stonyfield is part of the FAR proposal, and General Mills is part of the FAR proposal, and Danone is reaching out to us and wanting to talk to us. And, you know, I've said, you know, Monsanto, as an example, has a global supply chain of access to farmers. If they want to be providing inoculants and foliar sprays and things like that that are going to improve soil health, let them. I mean, let's work with everybody in the supply chain who is willing to engage in this process. We're not going to say you're bad, you're good, we like you, we don't like you. We're going to say it's about what works. And, you know, if a farmer's using your product and they report that they're using your product and the data says that your product works, great. If the data says that your product doesn't work, great also. Like, let's just let proper science guide the process. Science done openly, right? Science has got a really bad name because it's been, you know, manipulated and not really been done like scientifically. It's like you know, it's the deck is stacked. So, yeah, we've kept a really open framework, open perspective. Like, I'll talk to anybody, I'll work with anybody who wants to follow the rules of collaboration. And so far, no pushback. You know, I don't know really how many people know what we're up to, honestly. Nolan.
Okay, so I've got a question on the meat. You did indicate that a few years down the road you will have capabilities to test meat also. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we could do meat starting next month if somebody wanted to help us.
I guess that's one of the concerns I've got, because as I look at meat products and I consider, was it aged, and if so, how long? Is it fresh or is it frozen? What kind of diet did it have? Was it grass or was it grain-fed? And then the age of the animal. And all of those are factors that could affect the outcome of what you're proposing. for an analysis, and I'm just wondering how you're going to approach it, because management can most certainly change nutrient density, and I'm curious how you plan on evaluating your meat samples.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about just straight meat, not processed, salami or bologna or whatever. My understanding is that when a cow, as an example, is on a grass diet, the omega-6, omega-3 ratios get really healthy. And when it's on a grain diet, they get really unhealthy. Somebody sent me a report yesterday that it was between 2-to-1 and 16-to-1. There was just some, research with farmers that were claiming to do grass-fed beef, but some weren't. And they took the meat and they ran it through a lab at Michigan State, and they looked at the omega-6, omega-3 ratios and a few other things, and they found really profound variations. So I don't think that that the age of the cow is going to matter so much as what they were eating. Maybe there'll be some compounds that'll shift. It's really an open conversation, and we're not sort of proposing that we have the answer. We're proposing that we're going to open a conversation and engage a framework of data collection and invite people who know more than we do to argue about it until they can come to a conclusion. Let's engage the specialists in the field with sufficient data to come to a thoughtful conclusion. And at some point, we're going to have to say, okay, this is the best wisdom of the community. And then 6 months from now, hopefully we'll have a better idea, and we'll keep iterating. I don't think we've got it all figured out. All we've got figured out is that we want this process to occur, and we're trying to set the stage for it to happen as healthily as possible. What I've said is, there's a conventional, sandbox where people are playing, and that's fine. Anybody who wants to can play in that sandbox. We're going to build a whole new sandbox over here of open collaborative data collection and sharing, and anybody who wants to come play in our sandbox has to abide by the rules of being open and collaborative. And as long as you're willing to do so, let's have those conversations, and let's do data, let's do reports, let's publish papers, let's support that investigation. So, yeah. We've got a framework right now. We're calling it the Real Food Campaign. It already is a collaboration of multiple entities, organizations, and companies, and things like that. And we are actively looking for collaborators. Anybody who wants to engage in the process, please. We can't do this ourselves. Imagine a symbiotic ecosystem. Imagine a mycelial web. It's not just one organism that runs the show. It's an ecosystem. But it's an ecosystem of symbiosis, not of control. So that's really, if you want to talk more detail, I'm happy to get into it. But the issue is, primarily, people in general say, sounds like a great idea. Tell me when you're done. And we're like, it's going to take quite some time if nobody helps. The more people that engage, the faster it's going to happen.
I wanted to thank the organizers and the speakers for a day full of rich insights. One question that I often grapple with, and so any of you who want to weigh in on this, that equitable access to food, and that there's sometimes a gap between making sure that farmers and producers are paid a fair and equal amount for what they grow, and having food be affordable enough for all people to have access to quality food. So I was just wondering, Dan, you touched on that a little bit, but if any of you have insights into how we can work together on that.
Good question, tough question. I work with a lot of farmers who say they can't afford to eat at the restaurants they sell their veggies to, right? I think being able to have more access means that we're closer to where our food is grown. I think some of these labels that may have gotten farmers higher return for their veggies are also can also be seen as a disadvantage. In some areas, I know a number of farms that I work with that no longer certify organic. They consider themselves beyond organic, but because of that, because they're selling directly, they're able to get that higher value because their customers trust them and they don't have to pay for a label and do all the certifying. So increasing like internal costs for the production, I think, is really important. Calling out producers and boycotting producers that we know are creating slave conditions, like Driscoll, for strawberries. So just outright knowing who the players are that really are having entirely illegal situations for their workers, I think is important. Know in your area, like I know in my area, the CAFOs and the larger dairies that don't treat their workers well. And we know that we don't go and buy food from them. So I think it's being positive and proactive, as well as also calling out practices that we don't believe in.
I think that food insecurity, comes in large part from people not being on the land. And I think we've got an industrial model of culture right now, which is causing a lot of these problems systemically in the first place. I think, we're taught at age 5 to go sit still and shut up in a chair and do what you're told for the next 17 years or 12 years or whatever it is. And that we're trained to be cogs in an industrial wheel, which is entirely antithetical to human culture properly. And so we've got some much deeper systemic issues to be addressing. And where I live, every town has a road called Town Farm Road. And what that was people who were underprivileged, however you want to frame it, there was property that belonged to the town where everybody had land that they could grow their food on. And that was just the way that people that didn't have money were supported in the community. And that was the 1700s or whatever. And there was an opportunity for you to provide for yourself. I think we've got some much deeper systemic issues to address as far as how culture is organized. There also are some models that maybe would be much simpler to implement, like, food stamps. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of, what's his name? John Eichert from Iowa. It's a long-term, thoughtful agricultural economist. He's got this model of, basically regional areas, like there used to be a local power monopoly, like the town could control their electricity. We could do that with food. And the local town could say, all the money that's coming in from the federal government to provide food stamps, we can require that it all, go towards local food, high quality food, instead of Cheetos and Coca-Cola. I mean, there's all kinds of really systemic, thoughtful, interesting models out there for, tweaking the current system. But, we have to, I don't know, it's a much deeper conversation. And I like to say there's, 7.5 billion people on this planet. And, if each one of us works on one project, we'll have it all figured out. So we just have to have certain people that put their energy into this and come up with some really good ideas and say, look, guys, this is the plan that makes sense. Everyone's like, yeah, okay, great, we'll support that. So I don't worry about it because I got my thing I'm working on. But it's a good, important question.
This is a question for all the speakers. When you go in a supermarket, there's certain products that have shelf life, and there's products that don't have shelf life. And if you ever go into the portion where you talked about looking at being able to say, yeah, the beef or the quality of that product is, going to be able to be registered. Most of the products now, as far as your beef products, are sealed in plastic. And to me, it's not very appealing to see a steak in blood. I mean, I don't purchase it. I prefer to see stuff, you know, either not in plastic or not in a way that it can decompose and then lose its shelf life. And I know there are a lot of products that are used to spray apples to keep, you know, apples, like waxes and those types of things. And as a stage 4 non-Hodgkin's survivor for 15 years, what this panel has brought is a lot of what our next generation is looking towards. Finding a way to have quality food at a price that's affordable. But we need to start now, and we need to be able to do those things now, and so that future generations don't have to go through what I went through. So how do we do that?
I'll just say one short thing, which is that I think, you know, I try not to go to the grocery store. I try not to need to go to the grocery store because I grow most of my food or I can get it from my friends. And I think we've got a real serious problem when food is treated like a commodity and, you know, it's just a little piece of life. I mean, I just think we have a whole systemic cultural perversion going on where we're so far removed from nature and from the land and from the community in the first place. But yeah, I don't know if I've got an answer broadly.
For the next generation, I'm trying to pull the question out of your statement. But for the next generation who's growing up in a cancer environment and rural towns that around me that have extremely high rates of cancer, you know, we're starting to normalize the C word on some level, which is really frightening to me. And so I agree with Dan, like knowing your farmer and having these more localized food systems, understanding that we can't trust the government. We need to test our water ourselves, and we need to know what we're putting in our body is extremely important. Food is medicine, and preventative action, you know, is really important. For my children, I'm teaching them how to hunt at a young age. They know how to harvest chickens. They don't see blood as a problem to, you know, that's a gross thing that they can't see or touch, because they've learned about respectful harvest since they were little. So I think being able to expose our community to respectful harvest is also extremely important in understanding that that animal is a healthy animal and has one bad day and is going to one bad moment and is really gonna, you know, nutrify my body in that cycle, and being really aware of that direct cycle. I super appreciated your like how often your cells are replaced deal. I was trying to write it down because that was crazy. I mean, that really is very optimistic and hopeful for a lot of these things that I've been exposed to a lot of bad stuff on many of my jobs, and I think a lot about cancer and things like that you could get from other environmental ways, not just from food. And I'm regenerating. I'm getting new bones every, 7.
Take a little while.
Yeah.
I grew up on a dairy farm, and when a cow was no longer productive as a milk producer, she was repurposed. That's my new politically correct way. She was repurposed. And she was then in the freezer, not in the barn. But to get to your question, the first thing that popped into my mind was grow your own food. You'll understand how to get the soil you're growing things on to function at a high level and grow your own food. I look at my own neighborhood, my own block, and my neighbor directly behind me has a garden. But if I look 3 or 4 doors down in either direction, there aren't any gardens. There aren't any vegetable gardens. And you saw all the images that I had of all the different things that I grow. And that's always a point of discussion at home is, right, I look at the lawn and like, why do we have lawn? I already grow hops. I could grow barley there. It's like, no, we're not having barley on the front lawn. But you can grow a lot of your own food in a very limited space. And I was mentioning earlier, my garden is only about 20 by 40, and we can't eat all the food that I produce there. So it's really not that hard to do. But that would be my first thought, because then I know what I'm eating was grown on healthy, functioning soil, and I know what was applied or not applied to that system.
I was going to ask this of John, but he's not here. I guess there's 2 Johns here today. I'll talk to John Sticka, and you can all probably answer the question too. But your root crops, especially when you think of a larger scale than just a garden, but how do you minimize disturbance in your root crops for your future crop?
Like particularly carrots. If the soil is moist and it's well aggregated, I can pull a lot of those out. I don't have to dig them out. Sometimes I do. Potatoes I grow by just putting the seed piece on the soil, and then I cover them with all the leaves and grass clippings and other stuff that all my neighbors throw away. I accumulate all that stuff, and then when I plant my potatoes, I just set them on the soil surface, cover them with all that. They grow up through that, and then in the fall, I just rake that away and pick the potatoes up off of the soil, so I don't have to disturb the soil to grow those kinds of things. So there's ways you can do that. You can minimize soil disturbance. The biggest soil disturbance I have right now is my friend coming and digging for earthworms to go fishing. And I always make him go way in the back of the garden so he doesn't disturb the part that I grow most of my stuff on. So
I think I just want to say, because it is an issue if you're thinking about logistics and practicality of picking potatoes and growing them on scale, and doing it mechanized, that you're probably going to be ending up, you're not going to be mulching, a 5,000 acre farm in Idaho to grow potatoes, right? So practically, we've got a creative tension between, agribusiness, monoculture, big scale, and backyard scale. And I personally, as well, grow a pretty decent patch of potatoes, but I'm only growing a couple acres altogether. And so I do dig them by hand, and I do put them in the ground. And, there's a circle about this big where you dig out, and then there's a whole bunch of areas where you don't. And I'm not so personally so dogmatic that I say I never can disturb the soil. But there are some creative tensions when we're assuming, massive scale farming, and we're questioning some of these practices. And I'm wondering if we should be assuming massive scale farming. What are the structures that we have in place that are part of what supports this separation from nature and separation from food, et cetera? I mean, if you can have a good living, a good lifestyle on not so much land, would you rather have a bunch of neighbors that also had some land? Would our culture be healthier if people were more in contact with nature? Somebody brought up Jefferson earlier today. I think it's the Jeffersonian ethic, the yeoman ethic, quote unquote, right? Back when citizens were only men, they said yeoman, so you can say yo woman if you want, but the concept is that an independent, self-sufficient landowner is the only person who's going to make a serious, thoughtful decision for multiple generations, and is the only person that should be allowed to vote in a democracy. It was landowners that could vote because those landowners who had connection to the land and were thinking practically for the long term. And I'm not saying we should necessarily restrict people's ability to vote based on land ownership, but the concept that when you're separate from the land, that you're not grounded in those practical, deeper, longer term decisions in relationship to community and things like that. I mean, we've got some really deeper philosophical, spiritual, political questions to wrangle with here. It's not just agriculture. It's not just polycultures and minimal tillage, I think, that are really the questions that all these things are bringing up. And so, yeah, I mean, it's how do you dig potatoes? Are you doing potatoes on scale? If you're not doing potatoes on scale, what's human culture looking like? How do we even consider that transition? Is it a nice thing to think about, but what are the practical logistics of trying to move towards that, or do we even want to? Anyway.
I super respect both of the ways that you grow potatoes. And I would say that just on a reality check is that, 1% of the American population is farmers, less than 1% is organic farmers, and I use a root lifter to disturb the soil for my garlic. A lot of the veggie growers that I work with, they're in their 20s, they're in their 30s, and their bodies are going out by the time they get 40 because we don't have enough farmers on the ground. So I am advocating for, find an implement. I'm all about farm hack. Use a root lifter for your potatoes. Rotate the crop. Use cover crops. Deep mulch things. Yes, of course. But for my area, I could be the potato garlic farmer for my whole county because there's nobody growing. But I don't want to wreck my body either. So I think finding that balance. I don't think we should I'm not advocating for the super large scale either, but just finding this happy medium. Yep.
And maybe a little bit of disturbance every once in a while is not the end of the world. Yeah.
I guess I was just curious on the permaculture type style farming. Because of the trees and stuff, North Dakota isn't really known for their massive amounts of trees or anything. What's the return on investment, or how long do you figure for a return before you can get a profit, and how much of a profit per acre or farm, or how much labor do you need for that type of operation?
So good question. You get fruit faster than nuts. So in terms of, orcharding, there are pretty well-based spreadsheets out there. There's a great perennial crop calculator that you could find from the Savannah Institute, savannahinstitute.org. That's a good one to start with, and you kind of put in your conditions into this worksheet, and including, expectations, number of species, type of species. So I think those are becoming more available, and I definitely encourage those kinds of crop calculators, especially for beginning farmer ranchers who are maybe have to submit a business plan to FSA for a loan. That can really help inform and also tell your loan officer you're not pie in the sky here on these numbers, but it all depends on what size stock do you have when you're planting. So are you planting little whips? Are we putting in some older trees? For demonstration farms, I want to put in a 3 or 4 year old tree because I want to get people excited and inspired, and I need to see some fruit quicker. So 5 to 7 years we're looking at for fruit if we're starting with little babies. On the nut end of things, we're talking 10, 15, 20 years, typically for temperate cold climates to see your return on nuts. Does that mean, that's tree, I'm talking about tree crop nuts. Hazelnuts, you start to see year 5 getting to good harvestable size. Now, if you have a really extreme, it's all variable, right? It depends is the kind of classic annoying permaculture answer, because it really does depend. Because if those got accidentally overgrazed by the cows or are in a really super windy environment, they're not going to produce as early as if they maybe were babied and given manure and mulch every year before winter and protected. So there's ways that we can make things grow faster. Crop calculator, Savannah Institute.
I think that's it. All right, thank you, everyone.